The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn that golden amber color across the horse farms of central Kentucky when Marissa Caldwell disappeared. It was October 7th, 1998. And the 23-year-old graduate student had been working late at the University of Kentucky Library, her usual spot on the third floor where she spent countless hours researching for her master's thesis in Southern literature. Her roommate, Diane Patterson, remembered her leaving their apartment on Woodland Avenue around 6 that evening, backpack slung over one shoulder, her long auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had smiled and said she would be back by midnight. That was the last time anyone who loved Marissa saw her alive. Lexington, in the late 90s, was a city caught between its genteel past and an uncertain future. The historic downtown still held the charm of old Kentucky with its brick buildings and the wrought iron fences that bordered Gratz Park. But underneath that polished exterior, the city was changing. The university brought in thousands of students each year, and with them came the complexities of a growing urban environment. Yet Lexington prided itself on being safe, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and neighbors knew each other by name. When Marissa failed to return home that night, Diane assumed she had stayed over at a friend's place, or perhaps pulled an all-nighter at the library. It wasn't until the following afternoon, when Marissa missed an important meeting with her thesis advisor, that real concern began to settle in. Professor Edmund Hargrove had known Marissa for 2 years and described her as meticulous, the type of student who would never miss an appointment without calling. When he contacted Diane, both of them felt that first cold grip of fear. The Lexington Police Department initially treated it as a missing person case. Detective Frank Delaney, a 20-year veteran of the force with silver hair and tired eyes that had seen too much, was assigned to the investigation. He started with the basics, interviewing Marissa's friends, family, and professors. Everyone painted the same picture of a dedicated, responsible young woman with no history of erratic behavior. She didn't use substances, had no enemies that anyone knew of, and was in a stable, happy relationship with her boyfriend of 2 years, Marcus Chen, a doctoral candidate in chemistry. Marcus was devastated. When Frank interviewed him in the small interrogation room at the police station, the young man could barely speak through his tears. He told the detective that he and Marissa had plans to get engaged after she finished her degree. They had talked about their future together, about moving to the East Coast, where Marcus had received a promising job offer. The detective watched him carefully, looking for any sign of deception, but all he saw was genuine anguish. Marcus had an alibi for the evening Marissa disappeared. He had been in his laboratory until nearly 11 at night, confirmed by his lab partner and security camera footage. Days turned into weeks, and there was no trace of Marissa Caldwell. Her car, a red 1994 Honda Civic, was found in the library parking lot right where she had left it. Her backpack was still in the trunk, along with her laptop and research materials. Her purse was missing, along with her keys and wallet. The library's security cameras showed her leaving through the main entrance at 9:47 that evening, walking alone into the darkness of the parking lot. After that, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished into the October night. Frank Delaney had worked enough cases to know that the first 48 hours were critical, and they were long past that window. He organized search parties that combed through the parks and wooded areas around campus. Volunteers distributed flyers with Marissa's photograph throughout the city. Local news stations ran segments about her disappearance. Her parents, Robert and Catherine Caldwell, drove up from their home in Nashville, their faces etched with a desperation that Frank recognized all too well. They held press conferences, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Catherine clutched a framed photo of her daughter, her hands trembling as she spoke to the cameras. But as autumn gave way to winter, the case grew cold. There were no credible leads, no witnesses who had seen anything unusual, no forensic evidence to guide the investigation. Frank worked the case as hard as he could, following every thread, interviewing everyone who had even the slightest connection to Marissa. He checked and rechecked alibis, ran background checks, and studied patterns. Nothing connected. It was as if whoever was responsible had been incredibly careful or incredibly lucky. Then, on a bitter cold morning in mid-December, a dog walker made a discovery that would haunt Lexington for decades. In a wooded area off Old Frankfort Pike, about 8 miles from the university campus, the walker's golden retriever found something buried beneath fallen leaves and frost-covered earth. The remains of Marissa Caldwell had been found. The crime scene was processed meticulously. The medical examiner determined that Marissa had passed away from blunt force trauma to the head. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she had fought back against her attacker. But beyond these basic facts, there was frustratingly little to go on. The body had been in the elements for over 2 months, and any trace evidence that might have been present had been degraded or washed away by rain and time. There were no fibers, no hair samples, no DNA that could be recovered. Whoever had done this had left almost nothing behind. Frank Delaney worked the case with renewed intensity. The discovery of Marissa's body transformed it from a missing person investigation into something far more serious. The entire community was in shock. Parents of university students demanded answers. The local media covered every development, but despite the pressure and the resources dedicated to the case, Frank found himself hitting wall after wall. Every lead that seemed promising ultimately led nowhere. Every suspect who emerged had an alibi or no connection to the victim. The detective interviewed Roger Whitfield 3 times during the initial investigation. Roger was a maintenance worker at the university library, a quiet man in his early 40s who had worked there for nearly 15 years. Several people mentioned that he had sometimes spoken to Marissa when she was studying late, bringing her coffee from the vending machine or asking about her research. When Frank first talked to him, Roger seemed nervous but cooperative. He said he remembered Marissa, that she was always polite and friendly. He had seen her that night, he admitted, as she was leaving the library. He had been emptying trash bins near the entrance, but he insisted he had no other interaction with her and knew nothing about what happened after she left. Roger's nervousness bothered Frank, but nervousness alone wasn't evidence. The man had no criminal record, not even a traffic violation. His colleagues described him as reliable and quiet, someone who kept to himself but did his job well. He lived alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of Lexington, had no family in the area, and spent most of his free time watching television or working on his old truck. When Frank checked Roger's alibi for the night Marissa disappeared, it was thin but not impossible. Roger claimed he had gone straight home after his shift ended at 10:30, had watched television and gone to bed. No one could confirm this, but no one could disprove it either. Frank even went so far as to search Roger's home with a warrant, but they found nothing. No signs of violence, no items belonging to Marissa, nothing that connected Roger to the tragedy. The detective's instincts told him something was off about the maintenance worker, but instincts weren't enough. Without evidence, he had to move on to other possibilities. The case consumed Frank Delaney for years, even as other cases came across his desk. Even as the department eventually classified Marissa Caldwell's case as cold, he couldn't let it go. He kept the file in his office, would pull it out on quiet afternoons, and review every statement, every piece of evidence, every timeline. He attended Marissa's funeral, standing in the back of the church as her family and friends mourned. He watched Marcus Chen sob at the graveside, watched Marissa's parents age a decade in the span of that single ceremony. He made a promise to himself and to them that he would never stop looking for answers. Years passed. Frank Delaney retired from the Lexington Police Department in 2008, but he took copies of the Caldwell case file with him. His wife, Patricia, understood his obsession. She had lived through enough sleepless nights and distracted dinners to know that this case was different, that it had burrowed into her husband's soul in a way that others hadn't. In his retirement, Frank would sometimes drive out to the spot where Marissa's body had been found. He would stand there in the quiet woods, trying to understand what had happened, trying to see what he had missed. The community of Lexington slowly moved forward, though Marissa Caldwell was never truly forgotten. Her parents established a scholarship in her name at the university. Marcus Chen eventually moved away, unable to stay in a city that held so many painful memories. Diane Patterson graduated and left Kentucky, though she would later say that not a day went by when she didn't think about her roommate. The case became one of those unsolved tragedies that haunted a place, whispered about in dorm rooms, and mentioned in true crime blogs that cataloged unsolved cases from across America. Roger Whitfield continued working at the university library for several more years before taking an early retirement in 2004. He seemed to fade even further into the background of Lexington life, rarely seen in public except for trips to the grocery store or the occasional visit to the hardware store. His neighbors on Prescott Lane barely knew him. He kept his lawn mowed and his house maintained, never caused any trouble, never drew any attention to himself. He was, in every way, unremarkable. But in 2019, something changed. Detective Sarah Brennan, a young investigator with the Lexington Police Department's Cold Case Unit, was assigned to review old unsolved cases using new forensic technology. DNA analysis had advanced dramatically since the late 90s, and techniques that hadn't existed when Marissa Caldwell's body was found were now standard procedure. Sarah had heard about the case during her training, had read the old file with its meticulous notes in Frank Delaney's careful handwriting. She reached out to the retired detective, and they met at a coffee shop downtown. Frank was 71 years old now, his hair completely white, his hands spotted with age. But when he talked about Marissa Caldwell, his eyes sharpened with the same intensity they had held 20 years earlier. He walked Sarah through the entire investigation, every detail he remembered, every suspicion he had harbored. When he mentioned Roger Whitfield, Sarah noticed how his voice changed slightly, how he leaned forward in his chair. "I never could shake the feeling about that man," Frank said, stirring his coffee absently. "Nothing concrete, just something wasn't right. But we had nothing on him, nothing at all." Sarah listened carefully, then made a decision. She would take another look at the physical evidence from the case, specifically any items that might still contain biological material suitable for DNA testing. The problem was that most of the evidence from Marissa's body had been too degraded to yield results back in 1998. But technology had improved. Maybe there was something that had been missed, something that modern techniques could now detect. The evidence had been stored in the department's archives, carefully labeled and preserved. Sarah requested everything related to the case and spent weeks going through it with forensic specialists. Most of it was exactly as the original reports had described, too damaged, too contaminated, or simply lacking any useful biological material. But then they found something that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Marissa's jacket, the denim jacket she had been wearing the night she disappeared, had been recovered with her body. It had been badly deteriorated from exposure to the elements, and the original forensic team had found nothing useful on it. But Sarah noticed something in the photographs from the original crime scene processing. There was a small tear in the jacket's collar and what appeared to be a dark stain near the tear. The original report had noted it, but dismissed it as likely being from soil or decomposition. Sarah sent the jacket to a private forensic laboratory that specialized in extracting DNA from challenging samples. Using new extraction techniques and more sensitive testing methods, the lab was able to isolate a small sample of biological material from the stained area. It took weeks to process, but eventually they had a partial DNA profile. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to run through the national database. There was no match in the criminal database, which wasn't surprising, but Sarah had anticipated this. She authorized a familial DNA search, a relatively new technique that could identify potential relatives of the DNA profile by looking for partial matches. This time they got a hit. The DNA from Marissa's jacket showed markers consistent with someone related to a person in the database, someone who had been arrested for a DUI in 2015. Sarah traced the connection and felt her pulse quicken. The person in the database was Timothy Whitfield, age 38, arrested in Louisville for driving under the influence. And Timothy Whitfield had an uncle named Roger Whitfield, currently age 63, living in Lexington, Kentucky. It wasn't proof, not yet. Familial DNA could narrow down suspects, but couldn't definitively identify them without a direct sample from the person in question. But it was more than enough for Sarah to get a court order for Roger Whitfield's DNA. The judge approved the warrant based on the combination of the familial DNA matched Roger's connection to the victim through his work at the library and his presence at the scene on the night of Marissa's disappearance. On a warm morning in June 2020, Detective Sarah Brennan and 3 other officers knocked on the door of Roger Whitfield's house. He answered wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans, his hair gray and thinning, his face lined with age. When Sarah explained that they had a warrant for a DNA sample, Roger's expression barely changed. He seemed almost resigned, as if he had been waiting for this moment for 22 years. They swabbed the inside of his cheek right there on his front porch, documented the sample, and informed him that they would be in touch. Roger said nothing, just nodded and closed the door. Sarah watched him through the window as they walked back to their vehicle. He stood in his living room, perfectly still, staring at nothing. The DNA results came back 3 weeks later. It was a match. The biological material found on Marissa Caldwell's jacket contained Roger Whitfield's DNA. The probability of it being anyone else was less than 1 in several billion. Sarah called Frank Delaney immediately. The retired detective's voice cracked when she told him. After 22 years, they finally had their answer. But having an answer and proving what happened were 2 different things. Sarah knew they needed more than just the DNA evidence. They needed to understand how it got there, needed to build a case that would hold up in court. She obtained a warrant to search Roger Whitfield's home again, this time with the knowledge that he was definitively connected to Marissa's death. The search took 2 full days. Roger's house was neat and orderly on the surface, but as investigators dug deeper, they found something disturbing. In the basement, behind a false wall that Roger had constructed years ago, they discovered a small hidden room. Inside were dozens of photographs, all of young women who had attended the University of Kentucky over the years. The photos appeared to have been taken without the subject's knowledge, captured as they studied in the library, walked across campus, or sat at coffee shops. And among those photographs were at least 20 of Marissa Caldwell. The investigators also found a journal, a spiral-bound notebook filled with Roger's handwriting. Page after page detailed his thoughts and fantasies, his observations of the women he watched. The entries about Marissa were particularly extensive. He had tracked her schedule, knew where she lived, knew her routines. The final entry about her was dated October 7th, 1998. It was brief, just 3 sentences. "She smiled at me tonight. She doesn't understand. It had to happen." Sarah Brennan read those words and felt a chill run down her spine. They had found not just evidence of what Roger had done to Marissa, but evidence that he had been stalking multiple women for years. She immediately cross-referenced the photographs with missing person cases from the past 2 decades. Most of the women in the pictures could be accounted for, had graduated, and moved on with their lives. But there were 3 others besides Marissa who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. 1 in 1994, 1 in 2001, and 1 in 2003. All had been students at UK. All had been young women with similar physical characteristics, slender, with long, dark, or auburn hair, in their early 20s. The realization of what they had uncovered was staggering. Roger Whitfield wasn't just responsible for what happened to Marissa Caldwell. He was potentially a serial predator who had been operating in Lexington for at least a decade, perhaps longer. The cold case unit immediately began reinvestigating the other disappearances, looking for connections, for evidence that had been missed the first time around. On July 15, 2020, Roger Whitfield was arrested and charged with the passing of Marissa Caldwell. The arrest made national news. Lexington was shocked. The quiet maintenance man who had worked at their university, who had lived in their community for decades, had been hiding a terrible secret all along. Parents of former students called the police department wanting to know if their daughters had been among the women in Roger's photographs. The community demanded answers, demanded to know how this could have happened, how someone could have operated in their midst for so long without being caught. Frank Delaney attended the arraignment, sitting in the courtroom gallery as Roger Whitfield was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly, and Frank saw no remorse there, no emotion at all, just a flat, empty stare. The retired detective thought about all the years he had spent searching for answers, all the nights he had lain awake wondering what he had missed. He had been right about Roger all along, but right wasn't enough. Evidence was what mattered, and the evidence hadn't existed until technology caught up with intuition. The trial was scheduled for the following spring, but Roger Whitfield never made it to trial. In November 2020, while being held at the Fayette County Detention Center, he took his own life in his cell. The guards found him early one morning, and despite immediate medical attention, he could not be revived. He left no note, no confession, no explanation for why he had done what he did. His passing brought an end to any hope of getting full answers about the other missing women. The investigations into those cases continued, but without Roger to question, without his testimony or cooperation, connecting him definitively to those tragedies proved difficult. DNA evidence eventually confirmed his involvement in one of the other cases, a 21-year-old student named Rebecca Torres, who had disappeared in 2001. But the other two cases remained officially unsolved, though investigators had little doubt about who was responsible. For Marissa Caldwell's family, the arrest and Roger's subsequent passing brought a complicated kind of closure. Catherine Caldwell, now in her 70s, gave a statement to the press. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were red from crying as she spoke about her daughter, about the decades they had lived with unanswered questions, about the bittersweet nature of finally knowing the truth. She thanked Detective Delaney, who stood beside her, and Detective Brennan, who had refused to let the case remain forgotten. She said that while they could never get Marissa back, knowing what happened allowed them to stop imagining endless, horrific possibilities. It allowed them to focus on remembering their daughter as she had been, brilliant, kind, full of promise. Robert Caldwell had passed away in 2015, never knowing what had happened to his daughter. Catherine said she took some comfort in believing that he knew now, wherever he was, that justice had finally come for Marissa. Marcus Chen, who had moved to Boston and built a life there, released a statement saying that he had never stopped loving Marissa, that a part of him had been frozen in time since that October night in 1998. The arrest, he said, didn't erase the pain, but it did allow him to finally begin to process it, to accept that the future he and Marissa had planned would never be, but that her memory could be honored by living fully in the present. The University of Kentucky held a memorial service for Marissa and for Rebecca Torres, acknowledging both young women whose lives had been cut short, whose potential had been stolen. The university also implemented new safety measures, increased lighting in parking areas, added more security cameras, and established a program to ensure that no student would ever have to walk to their car alone late at night if they didn't want to. It was a small gesture, perhaps insufficient, but it was something. Detective Sarah Brennan received commendations for her work on the case, but she always deflected the praise to Frank Delaney. She said that without his meticulous documentation, without his refusal to let the case go cold in his mind, even after it had gone cold officially, she would never have known where to look, what to question. The two of them, separated by a generation, but connected by their dedication to finding truth, had worked together to bring some measure of justice to a young woman who had deserved so much more from life. Frank Delaney kept a photograph of Marissa Caldwell on his desk at home, the same photo her mother had clutched at those press conferences so many years ago. In it, Marissa was smiling, her eyes bright with intelligence and hope, her whole life ahead of her. Frank would look at that photo sometimes and think about all the what-ifs, all the ways things could have gone differently. If someone had walked out to the parking lot with her that night, if the library had better lighting, if he had pushed harder on Roger Whitfield in those initial interviews, found some way to get a warrant, to dig deeper. But he knew that path led only to madness. What mattered was that the truth had finally emerged from the darkness. The case of Marissa Caldwell taught Lexington, Kentucky many things. It taught them that evil could hide in plain sight, that the person who seemed most ordinary could harbor the darkest secrets. It taught them that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still arrive if people refused to give up, if they kept pushing, kept questioning, kept believing that truth mattered. It taught them about the importance of advances in forensic science, about how technology that didn't exist when a tragedy occurred could later provide answers that seemed impossible to find. But perhaps most importantly, it taught them about the value of a single life. Marissa Caldwell had been one person among millions, one student among thousands, one daughter, one girlfriend, one friend. But her loss had echoed through decades, had touched countless lives, had changed a community. The ripples of what happened to her on that October night in 1998 spread far and wide, affecting people who had never met her, but who recognized in her story the fragility of life and the importance of holding tight to the people we love. The woods where Marissa's body was found have been preserved as a nature area. The city placed a small memorial there, a simple granite stone with her name and dates, and a quote she had once written in her thesis proposal: "In darkness we seek light, in silence we seek voice, in absence we seek meaning." Visitors sometimes leave flowers there, especially in October, when the leaves turn that same golden amber they had been turning the night she disappeared. Frank Delaney visited the memorial once, shortly before his own health began to fail. He stood in the quiet woods, listening to the birds and the rustle of wind through the trees, and he spoke to Marissa as if she could hear him. He told her that he was sorry it had taken so long, sorry that he hadn't been able to save her, sorry that her life had been cut short before she could achieve all the things she had been capable of achieving. He told her that she had been loved, that she was still loved, that she would not be forgotten. As he walked back to his car that day, Frank thought about all the cases he had worked over his career, all the victims he had fought for, all the families he had tried to help. Marissa's case had been the one that stayed with him longest, the one that had defined his retirement, the one that proved to him why he had chosen to become a detective in the first place, not for glory or recognition, but for the simple, profound purpose of standing up for those who could no longer stand up for themselves, of speaking for those who had been silenced, of pursuing truth even when it seemed impossible to find. The arrest of Roger Whitfield and the solving of Marissa Caldwell's case sent shockwaves through the community of cold case investigators across the country. It became a case study in persistence, in the importance of maintaining detailed records, in the power of new technology applied to old evidence. Sarah Brennan was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences, sharing what she had learned, encouraging other detectives to never give up on unsolved cases, to keep pushing even when it seemed hopeless. She always began her presentations with Marissa's photograph, that same image of a young woman full of hope and promise. She would tell the audience that this wasn't just a case number or a statistic. This was a person who had dreams and fears, who had loved and been loved, who had mattered. And that was why the work they did was so important, why they couldn't afford to let cases go truly cold, why they had to keep fighting for answers even decades after a tragedy occurred. The Caldwell case also led to changes in how the Lexington Police Department handled evidence preservation. Recognizing that technology would continue to advance, that techniques impossible today might be routine tomorrow, the department implemented new protocols to ensure that evidence from serious cases was preserved in the best possible condition for future analysis. They increased their cold case unit's resources, hired additional investigators, and partnered with forensic laboratories that specialized in extracting DNA from challenging samples. These changes came too late for Marissa, but they offered hope for other families, still waiting for answers, still wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The department reopened dozens of cold cases, applying new techniques and fresh perspectives to old evidence. Some cases yielded new leads, new suspects, new possibilities. Others remained frustratingly opaque, but the effort itself mattered, the commitment to never truly giving up on the search for truth. For the community of Lexington, the Caldwell case served as a somber reminder of the world's capacity for both darkness and light, the darkness of what Roger Whitfield had done, the years he had spent stalking and harming young women, the lives he had destroyed, but also the light of people like Frank Delaney and Sarah Brennan, who had dedicated themselves to finding justice, who had refused to let Marissa be forgotten, who had worked tirelessly to bring truth to light, even when it seemed impossible. It reminded them that safety was not something to be taken for granted, that vigilance was necessary, that communities had to look out for one another. Parents had difficult conversations with their college-age children about awareness, about trusting instincts, about the importance of simple safety measures like not walking alone late at night. The university implemented programs to educate students about personal safety, to create a culture where looking out for each other was the norm rather than the exception. But the case also reminded them that even in a world where terrible things happen, where predators hide in plain sight, where young lives are cut short for no reason that makes any sense, there are people who will fight for justice. There are people who will not rest until the truth is found. There are people who care enough to spend decades pursuing answers, to apply new technologies, to keep faith that justice, however delayed, will eventually arrive. Marissa Caldwell's story ended in tragedy, but it also became a story about the enduring human commitment to truth and justice. It became a story about how one detective's intuition, combined with another detective's determination and the advancement of forensic science, could finally provide answers that once seemed forever out of reach. It became a story about a community learning to be more vigilant, more caring, more committed to protecting its most vulnerable members. As the years continue to pass, as the people who knew Marissa personally grow older and eventually pass on themselves, her story will remain. It will be remembered in the scholarship that bears her name, in the memorial that stands in those quiet woods, in the case files that serve as teaching tools for new generations of law enforcement officers. It will be remembered by those who understand that every cold case represents not just an unsolved mystery, but a life that mattered, a family that still grieves, a community that still seeks answers. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Marissa Caldwell's story, that in the face of darkness, we must seek light, that in the face of silence, we must seek voice, that in the face of absence, we must seek meaning. Not because it will bring back what was lost, not because it will erase the pain of those left behind, but because it affirms our shared humanity, our collective commitment to the idea that every life has value, that every person deserves justice, that truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, is always worth pursuing. The autumn leaves still turn golden amber in Lexington, Kentucky every October. The university library still stays open late for students working on their research. Young women still walk to their cars in the evening darkness. But now there is better lighting, more cameras, more awareness. Now there is a community that learned from tragedy, that took the loss of Marissa Caldwell and Rebecca Torres and the others and vowed to do better, to be more vigilant, to create a safer environment for the next generation. And somewhere in that city, in a file drawer in the cold case unit, Sarah Brennan keeps working on the cases that came before Marissa, the ones that are still unsolved, still waiting for the technology or the insight or the lucky break that will finally provide answers. She does this work because Frank Delaney taught her that every case matters, that every victim deserves someone who will fight for them, that giving up is never an option when truth and justice are at stake. The case is closed now, officially, but its echoes continue to resonate through Lexington and beyond, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is not a sprint, but a marathon, that answers may take years or even decades to emerge, but that they are always worth waiting for, always worth fighting for, always worth pursuing no matter how long it takes or how impossible it seems. Marissa Caldwell was 23 years old when her life ended on that October night in 1998. She never got to finish her thesis, never got to marry Marcus Chen, never got to become the professor or the writer or whatever she might have chosen to be. But her legacy endures in the changes her case brought about, in the lives it saved through increased awareness and better safety measures, in the cold cases it inspired other investigators to solve. In the end, that is what we owe to those we have lost. Not just to remember them, but to learn from their stories, to let their experiences shape us into better, more vigilant, more compassionate people, to ensure that their lives, however tragically cut short, still have meaning and purpose, to carry forward the light they brought into the world, even after that light has been extinguished. The community of Lexington, Kentucky learned this lesson the hard way through the loss of Marissa Caldwell and the long search for answers that followed. But they learned it well, and they have worked to honor her memory by creating a safer, more aware, more connected community. They have shown that even in the face of the darkest evil, the human spirit can rise up, can persist, can refuse to accept that justice is impossible or that truth will never be found. And in that persistence, in that refusal to give up, in that commitment to seeking answers no matter how long it takes, we find perhaps the greatest tribute we can offer to those who have been lost. We continue the fight they can no longer fight for themselves. We speak the words they can no longer speak. We pursue the justice they can no longer pursue. And in doing so, we keep their memory alive. We affirm their value. We declare that their lives mattered and will continue to matter as long as there are people who remember, who care, who refuse to let their stories fade into silence. That is the legacy of Marissa Caldwell. That is the lesson her story teaches us. And that is why, more than 2 decades after that October night in 1998, her name is still spoken, her case is still studied, and her memory is still honored by those who understand that in the pursuit of truth and justice, no amount of time is too long to wait, no obstacle is too great to overcome, and no life is too small to fight for.